Our task, what I'm going to tell you about today, you've heard a lot about the ySKILLS project in different presentations, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but to tell you more a little bit about what we actually did. So this is a piece of work where we've tried to translate the research from the ySKILLS project into policy recommendations. And as you have already heard how much and how varied the project has been, you can imagine that the work was, it was not just me that was involved in this. So it was also my colleagues Elizabeth Stocksterd, who many of you know, and Jenny Kritsina, who has been involved. And we've been working on this at UIO, at the University of Oslo, for the past year or so. But not just us, also working in collaboration with the different work packages, with the different people working with the generating the evidence to try to make a sense of what was coming out of the project, and then also in our own work package 7, working with colleagues to really try to make sense and see what is the narrative, what is coming out of the project, what are the most important things, the most important messages that we need to go and communicate to policymakers. So very much a joint effort, and it was very much required as well. So this is a poster which was drawn by a technical illustrator, Laura Solavo, at a meeting that we had in Oslo in May in 2022. And at that point, we were still kind of very much at the beginning of communicating kind of the research and the findings coming out of the ySKILLS project. But there are a number of things that this poster already started to communicate, I guess, about what was important, namely vulnerability. And as you've heard so many times in so many different presentations today, this idea that, you know, digital skills, they're not evenly distributed across European children, that impacts the extent to which children can participate in digitalized societies, and vulnerabilities, and addressing vulnerabilities is an important aspect of trying to get at that equality and trying to get to more equal societies and help children to participate. So this was already starting to crystallize at that time, and as well as that, the work that was done in terms of conceptualizing digital skills and the 4 dimensions and both the practical and the knowledge items, and how this works as digital literacy, and the idea that not only are digital skills differently distributed, but also that the skills in themselves have different dimensions, and that those are developed to different extents amongst children and young people. So I think these were the most important messages that we were hearing and that we needed to communicate. So our task was to present the project's main recommendations in terms of policy and practice, and to, in the form of pan-European evidence-based recommendations, appropriately qualified, so this is also an important aspect, according to the strength of the evidence and potential limitations. And so this was the job that we had to do, and our aim in doing that was to promote children and young people's digital inclusion and well-being in close collaboration with stakeholders. So this is what we want to achieve in terms of addressing the aim of the ySKILLS project, and looking at this unequal distribution, I guess, of digital skills and the consequences that has for society. So what we did was that we took all of the outputs that were available, and as they became available from the ySKILLS project, we had about 23, 24, I think, deliverable reports looking at different studies, different kinds of empirical evidence, articles that were coming out gradually along the way, and tried to get these together to review what was in them and to look at the recommendations that the researchers behind these publications were making for policymakers and for different kinds of stakeholders. So we took all of the recommendations, we listed them, and then we began to categorize and try to organize them in terms of, I think we had at one point over 230 different individual recommendations. There was a lot of overlap between those, of course, but we were trying to distill those down and see what were the kind of main categories. And in addition to that, we were also looking at, well, who are the stakeholders that we want to communicate with? So from the bottom up, coming from the research and trying to establish what stakeholders we wanted to address. And at one point, again, we had 14 different stakeholder groups. So we were trying to look at what are the commonalities between these stakeholders and how can we direct particular recommendations towards stakeholder groups, again, to make sure that we actually have the impact that we want in terms of achieving our goal. So we designed, or we narrowed it down to 3 main stakeholder groups. These were Pan-European, EEA, and European policymakers and regulators. They were national regulators and also educational authorities. And I'll say a bit more about those in a minute. But what we did was we took our recommendations then together, and also, I don't have the photo of the Post-its, but we also took them to Vienna, where we had a nice meeting where we basically sat down and we said, look, this is what we think we might be recommending in terms of kind of the outcomes of this project. This is who we think we might be communicating with. Do you agree with these? Why do you think that these might be recommendations that would be relevant? And how could they be implemented in practice? So we had a workshop where we kind of brainstormed around that, took that back, and then tried to work further to synthesize the recommendations from there. And we also paid attention to the co-design jams, which Bika spoke about earlier, to try to see the recommendations that we had and the research that were presented to young people, to see what would the young people themselves then recommend in terms of what policymakers should do to address the issues that they saw as concerning coming out of their understanding of the findings. So we put this all together into the report, which is, I think, not yet online, but it's almost there and should be there soon. And there's a lot more detail, I suppose, in terms of the method and how we worked in there, which again you can read if you're interested. But I will just briefly tell you a little bit about these three different kinds of stakeholders, just so that so that you know, I guess, what we're aiming at. And firstly, and I think most importantly, are the European and the EEA, these kind of pan-European regulators and policymakers, because we agreed kind of at the outset of our work that this group should be the main focus for our research, because as researchers, if we want to kind of make an impact, if we want for people to listen to us and turn what we're trying to communicate into actionable items, we need to address it at the people who can actually implement this effectively in practice. So it was at this level that we were aiming to communicate with. And our colleagues, Eva and Iro, have also done a wonderful work in terms of looking at what the competences of the EU are, that you can read in an additional report, which I think Eva will say a little bit more about. But it's also about kind of understanding how the EU actually works and how, when you make recommendations to the EU, what they can do with that. So it's not all a case of, well, we'll tell the EU that they should do this and then that will be implemented in practice and, we're done. It's a case of, in some cases, the EU will make regulations at the EU level. In other cases, they will be able to support or coordinate with the national governments in order to implement change, I guess, implement new policies. And particularly for the ySKILLS project, it then becomes interesting because youth and education and health are areas that are the national policymakers' responsibility, primarily. So then we have the second stakeholder group, who are our national policymakers, where the idea is to communicate to them, to say, okay, we're recommending this to the EU, we would like you to pay attention to this, and also we have additional recommendations that you should think and consider implementing in your context. Because, of course, the national context will vary, and therefore different measures will be needed. And finally, we had educational authorities, and this is coming back to the point that Sonia was making about when we talk about digital skills, these kind of authorities are, of course, the primary ones that we consider relevant in terms of implementing policy and addressing practice, so communicating with practitioners, because we see this kind of natural connection between skills and literacy, children's skills and literacy and education. So what we had then was we had 12 recommendations for the EU and the EEA and pan-European policy makers. And now we have more detailed recommendations in the report, but I guess for this purpose and because of where we are in the day, will just summarize them. So most importantly was this idea that all children should have safe and equal access to the digital environment. And this is, I guess, again, coming from the purpose of the project, what was coming out of the project, and that, we need to think about that this environment should be safe and equal, and that they need digital skills in order to be able to participate. And then equal opportunities to develop digital skills is also one of the most important aspects. So again, coming back to vulnerability, to coming back to different kinds of differentiation, what are we trying to achieve with this overall project? And then to ensure consistent conceptualization and measurement of digital skills. So this comes to the YDSI index that we have, and trying to strengthen and ensure that the way in which that we're measuring digital skills across the European context is consistent, and that it's also robust, and that we can rely on the measurements that are there. Whether that means using this indicator, or whether it means ensuring that other indicators that are used and measured are also aware of this indicator and can implement and can align with it, I think that's a thing that needs to be considered. Then implementing regulation to enhance positive outcomes for children and young people, and this involves, I guess, ensuring that the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and all of these new forms of legislation are also implemented in ways that lead to positive outcomes. And I think it's also important to say that when ySKILLS started, a number of these new initiatives hadn't been introduced. So there's a lot of change kind of happening on the policy and regulatory front that we also need to be aware of, and that we kind of, that influence, I guess, when we're coming with strong recommendations, how we're addressing them, and what's we need to be aware of what's already there in terms of, how we can make change in the current situation, which is developing and evolving. I think that's the important point. And then also to continue to research the development of young people's digital skills. I mean, we see when we use different methods, we come with different insights, and we need to be aware that there are different ways of kind of measuring and different methods that we can use in order to investigate and explore levels of digital skills, but also to come to understand these skills and their more nuances in terms of both how they're accumulated and implemented in practice. When it comes to our recommendations for the national policymakers, these are similar. The overall aims are to ensure safe and equal access and equal opportunities to develop digital skills. But then we start to look at the findings from the project that have kind of broken down in some ways the different sectors in which children need to have digital skills. And I think particularly we have both support educational authorities to ensure that they can implement what they need in order to be able to support children in developing digital skills, whether that's teacher training or similar initiatives, but also for health authorities to ensure that health authorities and the people who will meet children, whether it's in therapy or other contexts, that they have the resources that they need in order to be able to understand and discuss the digital environment with the children that they're meeting. Also to recognize how digital skills interact with vulnerability, which again is one of the main messages, and then work to enhance the positive outcomes for children and young people. Throughout these, we also have specific recommendations, because one of the messages that we were hearing today, as well as the importance of listening to young people and young people's voice. So there are specific recommendations within the report that we will also, that work on this, like involving young people in the development of the curriculum, or in reviews of how to teach digital skills as well. Finally, we have the recommendations for educational authorities, and these are the authorities that provide direction for a range of different kind of functions, I guess, in society that deal with education, that deal with digital skills. So we have both schools and education, but we also have clinicians and social workers, parents and caregivers. So we see this as the way of communicating the recommendations from the project to the authorities that will then be able to take them and make recommendations for practice. And I think this was an important aspect that we needed to include in our recommendations as well. So we generated 4 main recommendations for these, but they're mostly to support the digital skills amongst teachers and other educational practitioners. So there are 2 recommendations around that, and there are also recommendations around how to implement homeschool communication with parents to ensure that parents are active and engaged and understand the digital world, but also to provide parents with digital skills in terms of how they can then work and ensure that their children develop the skills that they need. So I haven't said too much about the quality of the evidence and the limitations today. We have a review in the report where we go through all of the different studies that were basing these recommendations on, and we discuss the methods that are used and point to potential limitations. But what I would say is that all of the recommendations that we have come with, I think there is only one recommendation that is only based on one piece of empirical evidence. So most of the recommendations are based on a synthesis of the different studies, whether it's the longitudinal survey or qualitative studies. There's a combination of evidence that's underpinning, which I guess increases the robustness of what we are communicating in this context as well. And we've linked both in our deliverable report, which will soon be available, the recommendations to the different reports where the evidence is generated. And we're also working to produce a multimedia report. It's almost there, but we're trying to kind of make sure that when a policymaker reads the recommendations, that they can click further to the specific evidence so that they can see, okay, I know why they're coming with this recommendation, and maybe read a bit more about the context about why they should really consider to implement that in practice. So more to come, and I think that's it for now. Thank you.